We are the product of all of the little ingredients that go to make up our character. That can be the simplest of things. It can be an act of kindness. It can be an act of the most unspeakable cruelty. But all of that shapes us some way. It makes us who we are.
We went into the war not knowing how it would turn out or what was really to gain. So, I mean, you could be an accountant and just look at it from an accounting standpoint. Was it worth it? It was what we spend in lives and money worth what we got from it.
If we'd have won the war over there, things would have been a lot different. And we was on the verge of winning it. And it was so micromanaged by the White House and Johnson and everything that if they'd let the military do it, why, I'm sure it would have been a lot different. Just let the troops go over there and stomp butt, you know.
Do you think people understand it?
But they didn't then. I think they know a little bit better now.
You know, all the stuff that we did is going to frame the debate about Vietnam for the next 100 years, 200 years. There's the written records, but the visual stuff has a truth to it that a historian can maybe make his own judgment and say, I've heard about this, but look at this picture and look at this and look at this video or look at that film.
I have no kicks. The Army pays me every month a nice little handsome retirement, and I farm a little bit. And me and my old bird dog, we just get along, do what we want to, you know. Didn't get wrapped around the axle on a lot of stuff, like a lot of people did.
You know, I flew in on a charter plane. It was all service guys coming to Vietnam, and it was all set up for me. I had been at Army Pictorial Center. Our unit was a very peculiar unit, and we took care of each other. So I was taken care of before I even got there. So I got off the plane right away and called our detachment, and they came down and picked me up. I didn't have to do any of the in-processing, all that. And I was up in our detachment within a half hour having a steak and enjoying life. So we took care of our own. But then, you know, a couple days later, I'm on a plane down to Long Binh, and the war got very real. Actually, it got real that night. We got hit the night I came in. I thought it was, I asked one of the sergeants, is that incoming? He said, no, sir, that's outgoing. But it was incoming.
The challenge was we arrived on site and there was just a vacant field that had recently been plowed out of the jungle and swamps there. And there were a few of these general purpose medium-sized tents there. So we had to set those up, get something to shelter us, because in May of '67, monsoon season starts there in Vietnam. It rains every day. So you had
Not a little bit of rain.
Not a little bit of rain. I'm talking about, as I'll develop here in the story, enough rain to wash concrete out of a steel form, which would form the foundation of the buildings that you're supposed to build.
But the old Army cameras, you know, took great pictures, but difficult to deal with. You really needed to know your skills, shutter speed, ASA, all the variables that you had to put together to get a good exposure. And the equipment was bulky and heavy, because you're dealing with a large format. We shot Filmo cameras with no batteries, 100-foot load, so it was short, relatively short. It was durable, it was heavy. It had fixed focus lenses, which were difficult to deal with, but you could deal with it. And there were 3 of them on a turret, no zoom lens or anything like that. But the main thing was, when you were out in the field, if you were out in the jungle or wherever you were, that camera was going to run, even if you dropped it. And you could probably hit somebody with it, and if necessary, and it would still run. And the little guys that did this, if they could get their head through, they could get their whole body through. And even I didn't believe this, really. I'm going like, what? And you'd see the wire strung, and you see nobody can get through that. Well, we had guys that on their army that came to our army, Chu Hoi, they came over. They said, enough, you know, they gave up, came in, and then they would show us how they did it. And I filmed one of those demonstrations. Now I thought, wow, that's important, because this will go to base commanders and it's going to save lives. We traveled around the country on these little press cards that were, they weren't quite legitimate, but they looked legitimate. Our graphic shops did it up. And they would look for trouble. They would look for offensive operations or something to go on where there could actually be combat going on. And that's some of the best footage we got are basically operations like that where nobody told them to do it. They just did it. It was great in terms of camaraderie. We liked each other, we had common backgrounds, we had common experience, and it was just a great bunch of guys, and we're still friends today. I mean, like, all these years later, that's what brings this reunion together, is that people have those memories. You know, it was it's an intense situation. We had stuff, rockets coming in, or what, any day could have been your last. You just never knew. So under that kind of pressure, you make good friends, and that's, I think, really what, in the end, I think, was it Patton that said that's what you fight for? You fight for your buddy. I think that's true. You fight for your buddy. Not the country, not the flag, your buddy. You know, all the stuff that we did is going to frame the debate about Vietnam for the next 100 years, 200 years. There's the written records, but the visual stuff has a truth to it that a historian can maybe make his own judgment and say, I've heard about this, but look at this picture, and look at this, and look at this video, or look at that film. They get an impression, and it's just going to be even more so in this era, because now we've got sound, everything. It's almost like you're there.
Yeah.
And hopefully everybody will learn a little bit better and not make these mistakes over again that might have been made, because, it's so real, it's so in front of us now. It does make me feel good. And I have been back to Vietnam. And I was sad the whole time I was there. Although in the South, I think there's still a lot of good feelings for Americans. And naturally now they want the tourism and all that. But I didn't go to the North. I don't think I was ready for that. But I did do one job where we went down with the 50th Pole War. This was a Vietnamese unit that was a psychological warfare unit. And I made some friends down there. It was a couple of week assignment. We were there for quite a while. We ate with them. We stayed with them. They took us out in these little villages, and we saw how they were trying to win the hearts and minds of their own people. So I sort of got to know those guys. And most of their officers were actually from North Vietnam, very cultured and sophisticated. And they told me that the people in the South were less so. And this was their basic problem. Fundamentally, the South was just harder to motivate those people. And so they knew what they were up against. And the North had the more aggressive, more cultured, whatever you want to call it. So that's sort of the impression that I came away with. And I often think of those guys, what happened to them, because they were South Vietnamese Army. I remember one kid, Lieutenant M, that he was going to make a career of the Army. Well, obviously, that Army did not survive. So it makes you feel sad when you think about those things.
One time I got a phone call from my daughter. She said, I know you're very interested in Special Forces. History Channel's having a special. I think you'll want to see it. So I got my son and we sit down, we start to watch it, and he said, Dad, you shot that, didn't you?
You did?
Yeah. It was History Channel's, what was it called? It was called Suicide Missions Behind, MACV SOG Behind Enemy Lines. By the time I was ready for college, I had some military background. I had two years of ROTC from high school. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon University, studied architecture, but my math skills were terrible. So I transferred into industrial design. And then took 2 years of ROTC. And when I graduated, then I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Signal Corps. And somebody looked at my arts background and decided that I probably knew nothing about communications or electronics, and so they fortunately somebody put me in for photo school.
Did you like it when you got in there?
Yeah, that was the perfect place for me. Good photography requires that you're very aware of details, but opposed to that is the fact that you're being shot at, which creates a lot of havoc and high blood pressure and distraction, and so you're balancing those two things. You're trying to survive and you're trying to compose pictures and watch the lighting and just doing two diametrically opposed activities all at once. Very much so, but you're fighting the tendency to watch out for yourself as well as watch out for your photograph. And it's very stressful. Although one of the things that happens is you look through that viewfinder and you feel like you're in a little black room all by yourself and nobody can see you. Of course, that's obviously not true, but that helps calm you during a tense situation. One of the things that goes through my mind is I didn't shoot enough. At that point, I'd been trained, but I wasn't a professional photographer. And I was used to, my parents taking pictures on vacation. So you'd take one roll of film and, you'd stretch that out for the whole vacation. With the Army, I had literally unlimited amounts of film, but I was still shooting much too short and much too pre-edited, where I should have been, challenging myself to get something great every day.
Americans don't see combat the way I saw it when you all were bringing it back from Vietnam. I'm in my early 60s, so I remember watching it on the evening news, and you were right there. But we don't really see that now on American television. You think we're too far away from those things, and maybe we're a little sanitized and desensitized to what war is?
Very much so. That's always bothered me, especially, it seemed like when I was younger, you would actually see more violence on the news, and now they warn you to look away, even if there is the smallest bit of violence. And I think it makes it too easy to go back to war when, the politicians who aren't always the brightest people in the world, want to lead you into the next war. I think you really need to see what it's like to have somebody die right in front of your camera.
And you saw that?
I filmed that. That's part of the film I shot with the Pleiku Mike Force that appeared on the History Channel. We had a trail follower behind us. He was a tax collector, and he was also sort of tailing us. And we set up an ambush with our Montagnard mercenary soldiers, and we were taking a rest, and he walked into the ambush, and one of the Montagnards stood up, put an M16 right to his head, and emptied a magazine right through it. And strangely enough, when we got up to the trail to where that was, this guy was alive, not brain alive, but his more basic functions were still going, and you could see his last breath right on camera. And it's hard to look at, but I think people should see that before they vote for going to war without really knowing what the benefits of it are.
We were the advance party. We were supposed to get there, set up operations, and prepare for the follow-on units to come. That's usually my job, was to figure out the weight and the cubic measurements of all the equipment this unit had, and come up with a figure which would then be turned over to the transportation folks to figure out how many of these large metal Connex containers were going to be required to ship all this stuff. The challenge was we arrived on site and there was just a vacant field that had recently been plowed out of the jungle and swamps there. In May of '67, monsoon season starts there in Vietnam. It rains every day. Enough rain to wash concrete out of a steel form, which would form the foundation of the buildings that you're supposed to build. My 44 guys had an incredible pool of talent. They all looked at that vacant field at the same time and said, oh, this is not good. And I knew it really was not a good situation because I had just planned to send literally shipload of stuff behind us that had to go someplace. We're talking everything from cameras to tractor trailer loads of film that had to be put someplace out of rain in some kind of temperature storage, otherwise it was going to spoil. They all realized that they had to pitch in, officers and men alike, out there actually building an encampment for those that would follow. And they did this without grumbling. In addition to which, they also performed during the day doing their combat photo missions. But the guys that went out to photograph came back at night. They pitched in at night, and we poured concrete using the headlights from our Jeeps. It's one of those situations where it's a bad situation to start. A bunch of people come to the simultaneous conclusion that we got to make this good, and that they're good people make it happen. Well, then you can start deploying people full-time to their primary mission, which is assignment to combat units to perform historical photography, intelligence, after-action type recording, to create a visual history of what's going on. And that increased, the tempo increased as more and more of these individual elements arrived on scene. So by roughly November of that year, of '67, we were pretty much fully operational. I mean, you're asking somebody to put themselves in harm's way. You've trained them, you've been there with them through that training, they know what they have to do. You've provided them with a wherewithal to do it, but there's always that X factor. And I believe it is a heavy responsibility to know that you've actually asked somebody to do that, and they've gone out and done and accomplished what you asked them to do. Never ask anybody to do something that I was not willing to do personally myself. And so I took some jobs as well. And so you can't really effectively lead unless you've followed and been able to do what they do, know what their hardship is, know what they need to do the job. The thing that fascinated me was you could be standing on the same hill with a network news crew, and we didn't get the rushes or the finished product of our photography for at least 60 days after the fact. But when you got to compare side by side that same event, you would have thought you were on a different planet. And that really fascinated me. And later on in senior command colleges, I wrote a paper on the media bias in the Vietnam War. And one of the large problems was the guys who were actually shooting this material, even though there were producers in country, that material was captioned and packaged and put on a plane, flown to Japan, and then either uplinked or flown directly back to the States to be edited by a producer in New York or San Francisco. Now that person had no sense of what the larger picture was, other than what he was looking at on his moviola. And so there was a tendency, you could see the potential for error in what was being reported. Not out of necessarily a conspiracy bias, but just because there's too many links in this thing that are not, that they don't communicate. Or there's a limited communication between these links. Well, if folks are sitting at home, flip on the 6 o'clock news, their reality is the reality they're seeing on that little TV tube. It was a loss of trust. And if I were a commander and had civilian journalists covering my every move, and then 60 days later saw that their product in no way represented the battle, no matter what I thought the battle was, but in no way represented the reality of that thing, what faster way can you lose trust than that? So the tendency would be, as a commander, say, hell no, I don't want them around.
But was it, now with the benefit of hindsight, was it all worth it?
Yes, yes. And I'll tell you why. We are, whoever, the product of all of the little ingredients that go to make up our character. That can be the simplest of things. It can be an act of kindness. It can be an act of the most unspeakable cruelty. But all of that shapes us some way. It makes us who we are. And if we're smart, we try to pass that on to our children, to the next generation. Don't make the same stupid mistakes that we did. This is what you need to avoid. And you can study history. This has gone on since the Greeks at Thermopylae, that there's something to be learned in each episode, but the dynamic keeps changing. There are always going to be evil people in the world, and that means that each generation has to face that and overcome that some way. But there is running through that a thread of, this is what we learned. Since we perceive information, 80% of the information we perceive is visual. Visual is a very good way of communicating that.
First day like?
Well, my first day, you could see in a photograph there, we were wound up in the supply hooch, and we were all drunk as skunks. But when I crawled off that deuce and a half there at Long Bend, well, I thought, I couldn't even say it on TV or whatever, but I thought, hey, I'm here for a year, you know. There's only one thing to do, and that's just get down and do what you got to do, and that's it. Maybe the time will go fast that way. The first wave or first detachment, they had started building hooches and stuff, and they had got to the point where they were real good at laying concrete. And then after the first couple of hooches, their buildings went up. Why, they got pretty proficient at it. And so when we got there, well, we assisted them. And a couple of guys are really good at it, and you know, and then we got building bunkers. Lieutenant Bostrom, which was our team leader, Team 6, he decided that we could build the blast bunkers or mortar bunkers. I always wanted to be a photographer because I always figured the Army was going to do something historical, and I wanted to be there when it happened. And a lot of times I'd done that. So I got to be at a lot of historical places. Come to find out that when you go in historical places, it's hot and your feet hurt. You know, sometimes your back hurts, and everybody's going to look 500 years from now and say, that was a historical event and you should have been there. A lot of times you crawl in the lens, you know, and you just sort of, you get in there and you just sort of feel like that you're invincible because you're inside this lens. The yelling and screaming, normally you don't hear it. You're in your own little world. like behind Barracks 3 during Tet Offensive when those MPs got killed. They wanted to move a tank down there, and me and this other guy ran down there and got this guy and pulled him out of the way so the tank could go down. And we got back, they said, you know, what the heck were you guys doing down there? Why were you talking? Why were you standing there talking to each other? Didn't you see all those bullets flying around you? And we didn't see them, you know. And a lot of times, you don't see all that stuff. Matter of fact, sometimes you don't even hear it. You're just there until you're just doing your thing and crawl in the lens and shoot. We didn't know about, you know, all the things that were going on in the States until after we got back. Yeah, if we'd have won the war over there, things would have been a lot different. And we was on the verge of winning it. And it was so micromanaged by the White House and Johnson and everything that if they'd let the military do it, why, I'm sure it would have been a lot different. Just let the troops go over there and stomp butt, you know. There was, but when I came back, I went on recruiting duty in Bloomington, Illinois, with 2 colleges there, and you know, then they, I was in uniform and had college kids calling you baby killers, and they had no idea what was going on over there. We had somebody who took a slingshot and put a bolt through our window, and not only went through the window, but it went through the screen, the plastic window shades behind it. And we were told to check our vehicles for bombs, and sometimes they painted on us and whatever, painted signs on it. And there was fun points too. One time there was on recruiting duty, you know, everybody was burning their draft cards. So me and the Sergeant Hickman, we put a sign in the window that said, "Let us burn your draft card." The next morning, our supervisor was down there about ready to tear the window out because he had got a message from Chicago, DRC, which got a message from someplace up in the world above God and everything, you know, saying, you don't do that. So, well, we got a butt chewing, but that was a good memory, you know. And we went out, we photographed things, and we got into some serious things every once in a while, but most of it was just, you know, walking and sweating and crossing ditches and whatever. And every time you got into firefight or something, why, you could normally designate it by a particular date and time. I enjoyed what I did over the years. And now I'm out, retired, let somebody else do the farming, and I just sit back and play golf. So I have no kicks. The Army pays me every month a nice little handsome retirement, and the state of Illinois pays me a little bit more, and I farm a little bit. And me and my old bird dog, we just get along, do what we want to. The Vietnamese civilians were tied between both sides. The Americans didn't particularly trust them in cases where I'd actually seen where a woman had literally tried to throw a grenade, you know, or something, which made you sort of distrustful. And Viet Cong done the same thing to them. So these were people that were just in the middle of 2 different groups. Now the ones you got to know were very nice people. Matter of fact, the Vietnamese are very hardy and in my opinion, very strong and brave individuals, but they were sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. We had the mama sons that were there in the barracks, and every time mama san would start going around looking under beds and stuff, everybody'd go bananas because we knew she'd hid her pot someplace and we didn't want to get caught with it. So you had a whole barracks looking for this little bowl of marijuana because we knew Mama saw it hit it someplace and she got high and forgot where she put it. But other than that, well, you know. And then, of course, we run into them in the field. And those people looked at us skeptically because we'd shot at them and bombed their villages and everything else. But you tried to help them, you know.